Celebrating 75 years, the ILR School at Cornell University. ILR, shaping the next 75 years of work.
This is Harry Katz. I serve as director of the Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution at the ILR School, Cornell University. And I'm conducting a series of interviews with conflict resolvers. I'm asking those individuals how the pandemic has affected the conflicts they're dealing with, and also how the pandemic has changed how they do their work. The individuals I'm interviewing are connected to the Scheinman Institute in some way. They either serve on our advisory board or teach in one or another of our professional development programs. Today, it's my pleasure to be talking with Gwynne Wilcox, who's a lawyer by training, who's a union side advocate, and one of the key unions she represents is the SEIU 1199. Welcome, Gwynne.
Hi, Harry.
So it's nice to see you. Let me start with the first key question, which is how your work has changed during the pandemic, how the cases or the disputes or even any of the negotiations, how are those things changed during the pandemic for you?
Well, I would say, with the pandemic, what has happened is that as soon as we started, working remotely, and also the union started working remotely, I felt like we were just on, COVID watch. I mean, we didn't really know a lot about COVID, and then all of a sudden, every day there was, ups and downs and information that we really needed to be able to share with share with the union. The union was providing information, and how could they more effectively, communicate with their membership regarding the changes. So there was really, a back and forth in terms of exchange of information coming from the field, as well as what we were learning from the CDC and New York State and other places. But so in terms of work, is that what there were definitely issues that came up, in regard to labor relations. So
just on that point about the work and labor relations, did you start having cases involving health and safety issues, whether workers felt adequately protected, essential workers? I know you represent some of your members are either work in hospitals or they work in, it's the government doing essential services or nursing homes. Did you find that there was disputes about whether they had adequate health and safety protection, or who got called back and who didn't?
Yeah, so, what really happened is that it became a much more informalized system, because, both hospital, nursing home, and home care workers were, doing whatever they could do to service the, patients and so forth, and as well as, human resources, was all hands on deck, with particularly, in the hospitals in particular, but also in nursing homes. So, there was, as we all knew, we didn't know what PPE was before the pandemic, but everyone knows PPE. And so those issues came up very quickly, and regularly. So there were just a lot of a lot of discussions back and forth about how to provide PPE, what was appropriate PPE, as well as, other health and safety issues. So, over time, the union really increased its health and safety committees. A lot of those provisions were provided for in the collective bargaining agreement, but, some of them were more active than others, but certainly everybody then had to really focus on the crisis at hand.
So when you're dealing with those questions about PPE and other health and safety issues, was it always adversarial, or was it really problem solving? Because you can imagine the employer had an interest in keeping its employees safe, and they didn't, they either wanted to for moral, ethical reasons, or they just wanted to for business reasons, or they didn't want the bad publicity if those workers were not healthy. I mean, were you able to see that evolve, that it was really more joint collaboration and problem solving, or was it really more adversarial?
I would say that there was certainly the interest of making certain that everyone had the appropriate PPE. But I do think that there were probably some instances where there was some more tension. There were tensions between the parties because one of the biggest issues is the fact that there was a shortage. And so the shortage of PPE, was straining the system, and putting a lot of pressure on administrators, but as well as the staff. So, depending on what the relationships were between the parties, was whether there was that trust that as to whether the employers actually had it or whether they were, holding on to it until, because not knowing how, what was going to happen the next day or the days ahead. But there was definitely an industry cooperation. The union worked with the different associations to really strategize about how to bring in PPE into New York. So there was a lot of cooperation, but I would say depending on the institution and relationship and the need, there could be definitely strained relationships in that regard.
So, as time went on and the parties learned more about how, the issues and all, did things change? Also, as more workers were called back to work, did you find in the last few months the kind of issues you were dealing with changed, or is it still basically the same? It's about personal, protection equipment, whether it's adequate or not, and who gets called back and who doesn't, or have the issues evolved?
Issues have evolved. I mean, there are even in the healthcare industry, there are workers who are able to work remotely, and there were different arrangements that were made under those circumstances. So one of the things I didn't mention early on was that there were negotiations and between the parties regarding hazard pay or incentive pay where there were shortages and needs based upon the exploding numbers of COVID cases. And so by and large, there was success. And I'm really speaking more about New York because even though the union has jurisdiction, covers workers in other states, I'm going to really focus on New York for the purposes of this interview and this conversation because there, it would vary. But so there was definitely a lot of success in terms of working out hazard pay and or incentive pay, and by and large, those issues at some point became less of an issue as the surge decreased. And so employers went back to saying, well, you're not entitled to hazard pay at this time, and incentive pay, and there was a little tension. There were tensions there, and the union wasn't 100% successful in every instance. So as we entered the summer, things were PPE is probably like always kind of an issue, and not necessarily per institution, but there's still concerns, even when the numbers were less. And I would say that as time went on, it became back to what are the things that happened? One of the things that happened is that while the union and the employers were really on a pause time during the surge in terms of grievance and arbitrations, they began to focus on those emerging, a more important or emergency grievances that had to be addressed, with regard to disciplinary actions or other, contractual issues. And so I began to see that there were, more discussions about grievances, and then as we entered the fall, there were arbitrations that were scheduled, most of which were virtual arbitrations.
So let's talk about that, shifting into the virtual world. How did you find it, and how did you think the union found it? I mean, I do some work with the UAW in my own roles, and for them initially in last spring, they were very hesitant, to have a virtual hearing or to have meetings that were conducted over virtual technology. But over time, they, like the rest of us, learned how to do it. We now conduct our dispute resolution hearings virtually. Have you found the same thing, that there was a bit of a learning curve, but then parties got used to virtual?
Yes, I found that, I would say that most arbitrations were virtual. There were a few in-person arbitrations. Some arbitrators I feel like they were less comfortable with doing virtual arbitrations. And also, I would say that some management reps were less comfortable with virtual arbitrations in some instances. And so they might be encouraging the parties to do in person. And, there were some reps who were willing to do in person. But that was not it was not required, and most advocates were more comfortable doing virtual arbitrations.
So when you're doing a virtual arbitration or mediation or negotiations, do you think it changed the nature of the conflict, or did it advantage one side or the other, or what were your takeaways from those kind of experiences?
I think that, if a year ago, if we had said we're going to do virtual arbitrations, I think there would have been I think on either side of the table, there would have been major concerns, and maybe even arbitrators would have had concerns as well. But, it's really been pretty seamless in terms of going from, in person to virtual. I mean, there are definitely, I think, a level of efficiency in terms of receiving documents in advance. Parties are looking to move the cases if they're interested in doing virtual, and so some of the shenanigans or some of the grandstanding is not there. We just want to get cases done, and so it's certainly we're doing this process because of for safety reasons, but I think that COVID has really taught us that it's kind of prioritized life for us, right? For everybody.
Yeah.
So let's just figure out what's the heart of our problem, and let's try to move forward. If we can't settle it, let's move forward with the case and do it as efficiently as possible.
So when you're doing a hearing or a negotiation, did you find that you were able to bring someone into a virtual hearing that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to draw in? They're in a different location, or they're not as available for one reason or another. Did you find that it in some ways was better because if you really needed someone just for a little bit of testimony and all, that they were more easy to draw into a virtual hearing than it was to have to get them to come to a particular facility? I've heard that from some people involved, and I'm curious if you ran into that too.
Yeah, I mean, one of the cases I handled, we had some shop stewards, for example, who were going to testify, and it made it much easier to prep the case with them, as well as the fact that they would have been available for the hearing. So that made it a lot easier. I mean, one person was going to have a day off, another person was going to be able to do it around their work schedule. It turns out we didn't need them, but the fact was that they would have been accessible in a way that would have been much easier.
Yeah. So you've mentioned that the unions became more comfortable doing this. Even the parties overall just got used to it. So what do you think is going to happen when we come back to a more normal state of work, hopefully sooner rather than later? Do you think the use of virtual technology will persist? And what kind of mix do you see between using virtual technology versus going back to face-to-face arbitrations or other kinds of meetings?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the new norm is going to happen. I think the virtual world is going to be part of our regular work world. I think there'll be more with regard to arbitrations. I think there'll be more discussions about whether this should be a virtual arbitration or not be a virtual. And so I think it's going to. But yeah, I think they will certainly continue. I mean, one of the downsides, I think, or challenges with virtual arbitrations in particular is the technology. That not everybody has the access to Wi-Fi, or they're in a house where 5 people are using Wi-Fi, because everyone's working remotely, or their children are working remotely, and they may not have a dedicated room that they could be sitting in for hours on end for an arbitration. Maybe concerns about confidentiality of information. So there are some balancing or concerns, I think, going forward that will help to, I think will, spearhead the fact that some parties will definitely want to do in person. And I think it also depends on the nature of the dispute too. I mean, I think that some cases probably will, the parties might want to be in the same room, for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. So we've talked so far about sort of grievance disputes and all. Just on contract negotiations, I don't know if any of that has come up during this period for you or others in your office. What's your experience there? What's it been like for parties to negotiate agreements or modify agreements using virtual technology?
Yeah, I actually haven't, but in speaking with other colleagues about this issue, there have been there's been virtual bargaining. The in non-healthcare areas, some of those negotiations were in progress earlier on in the year. Once the pandemic began, others were healthcare. Some of them were somewhat delayed because there was a pause because of the crisis in the industry. But there was success. They took place. I think parties felt it was a good way to move things forward, and to get people not to have to focus on COVID every day. And to see that we are moving forward and not being stagnated. So what I've heard is that in some instances, workers were feeling comfortable about having communications with their employer, like being in a Zoom room or on Skype, and that would be an easier way, less intimidating. And I've also heard that some workers felt more intimidated felt intimidated being in in the virtual world because maybe they saw a close up of the boss. I don't know. So it varies. One of the things that was as a challenge is that to the extent that you're on the negotiations are taking place in a where there are lots of workers, and the people who are doing the negotiations can't possibly kind of keep up with what's happening, who's actually in the room.
You mean in a case where there's like a large bargaining committee where
Yes.
workers often would sit on the sidelines but watch
Right.
the bargaining? Okay, so
Right.
how do you pull that off
Right.
in a virtual?
So what happens is, so you have a meeting beforehand. You schedule the negotiations. You have a committee. You meet with them. So you're meeting virtually with them, and then other people are going to come into the room, the virtual room, and you are bringing them up to date and trying and letting them know what to anticipate in the negotiations. But then as time goes on, some of them drop off, other people get on. So, I think it's harder to manage a large negotiations, and when they're smaller, they're easier to manage in that way. And so, one of the things that we've learned that with regard to negotiators, they actually have to be a lot more intentional in terms of figuring out how to make sure that the information gets out to the membership and to the committee. And sometimes, in those negotiations where there are first contracts, those can be more challenging because it's new for the committee, it's new for the workers. And so I think it's when you're negotiating for successor agreements, it's often and smaller units, those tend to be, I think, they can be efficient, especially where you have multi locations.
Great, great. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else that you've been struck by in the pandemic, either the way it's changed issues or the process that we haven't touched on? Any
Yeah,
last thoughts?
yeah. I guess I would say is that maybe from where I sit and who, is that it's really, I think labor relations, while we've heard lots of horror stories out there, employers, I think a takeaway that they should have is that speaking to and communicating with their staff is so critical. It really helps to alleviate fears and concerns. And so, however those communications are done, whether they're in some staff meeting at an institution or whether it's virtually, or even email communications, it's real. That is, I think that is very critical because we all, hear a lot of information. Some of it's true, some of it's not, some of it doesn't even apply to the state that you're working in. But people come in with a lot of information, and so that's really important to have those communications because it really does help everybody. And ultimately, in terms of the employee's business, their business can be more effective.
Well, that's a great point. The need for more communication. can help avoid conflicts in the first place. And even if they
Exactly.
arise, it'll help solve them. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's what I was going to say. That's that's what we're we we, we want to resolve disputes. So if we can prevent the disputes or have a way of keeping those channels of communications going forward, that's important.
Great. So, Gwen, I want to thank you. It's been a really interesting interview, and I appreciate you participating in this, and I appreciate all the other work you do to help the Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution.
Thank you.
Hope
It's
to
my
see you
pleasure.
soon. Great. Take care.
Take care.
This has been a production of the ILR School at Cornell University. ILR, shaping the next 75 years of work.